Hey everybody, it's Atheist for the Cause here with another video for you. An article review. Actually, I have a lot of articles that I'm going to show you because we have a pretty serious situation here. And that is that Qatar and much of the Middle East have been cut off from each other, with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Bahrain and some others like Maldives, have all joined forces to cut off Qatar on the land, in the air. They're cutting off food. They're cutting off communications. Diplomatic ties have been severed. You can see here it says the four nations have closed air and sea links. So this is pretty serious stuff, which something this serious any country could consider an act of war, as it basically forces the hand of Qatar to do something, because they won't be able to continue on like this. So they have to change the situation in some way, either by giving in to demands or by starting a war or something to that effect. And it says, Trump is in on this as well, as he went to Saudi Arabia, and he says, so good to see the Saudi Arabia visit with the king and 50 countries already paying off. They said they would take a hard line on funding extremism, and all reference was pointing to Qatar. Perhaps this will be the beginning of the end of the horror of terrorism. Now let's get into this article, but keep in mind Qatar has been a pretty close ally to the United States in the past, but they've kind of been slowly going their own way and going in ways that harm the U.S. So it says, earlier this week, an alliance of Arab countries took the dramatic and unprecedented step of cutting all diplomatic ties with the small Persian Gulf state of Qatar. Actually, I think it's pronounced Qatar. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain say they made the move because Qatar's government provides material support for terrorist groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda that threaten security of the entire region. Qatar flatly denies this claim, and I'm going to show you that Qatar does actually support the groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other either rebel or terror-based groups. The neighbors have done more than dismiss some Qatari diplomats. They've severed all relations. The four nations have closed air and sea links and sent Qatari nationals home. Inside Qatar, which sits on a peninsula of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf, the impact is already being felt. Its stock market fell by more than 7% on the first day of trading following the announcement. Shoppers have reportedly flooded supermarkets to grab supplies before shelves empty. The country imports about 40% of its food from the Saudis. Over time, growth will fall, inflation will rise, Qatari businesses will suffer, and it will become much harder and more expensive for the Qataris to borrow money. The Qatar World Cup in 2020 may even be at risk. There's a lot here to cover. First of all, if you're taking in 40% of your food supply, why are you fucking with the Saudis? I mean, that alone should stop you from fucking with them, and until you get some other supply for food lined up. On top of that, Qatar has a relatively young and new leader, and I think it shows. His goals seem naive to me, where he wants to be allied to the U.S. He wants to be allied to Iran. He wants to have close ties with other Arab nations, such as Saudi Arabia. It it just, all of these alliances aren't going to work. But in regards to the Qatar World Cup in 2020 or 2022, they got it through corruption. They paid off the World Cup, and they actually beat out the U.S. The U.S. was second in line to win the World Cup in 2022, and Qatar behind Qatar, but they would have been probably first, but Qatar had paid off the leaders, and it ended up getting some people in the World Cup fired. There were even investigations done. I don't remember if there was jail time for anybody, but there might have been. Then when they actually went through and started like building their stadiums and stuff, they like worked people to death, literally, and it was like slave labor type conditions. So there's a lot going on beneath. It was like hundreds of people died building the stadiums for the World Cup. There's a lot of going on beneath the surface of this startling power play. For many years, Qatar has aggravated some of its larger Gulf neighbors, whom blame Al Jazeera. Remember, this is the Al Jazeera, its American arm, that was in bed with the Young Turks. And the Young Turks, my understanding is the Young Turks and Al Jazeera still have some slight connections to each other. And the Young Turks actually, they had a TV channel or something like that they ended up selling off to Al Jazeera. And then they maintained their like live stream channel on the internet. And then they went back into TV later and then stopped doing TV. And now the Young Turks is just completely online. It says, who blame Al Jazeera, a TV network directed by the Qatari state, for inflaming the Arab Spring that presented a direct challenge to their governments. Egypt has accused Al Jazeera of inciting terrorism, and there is definitely a link between the Qatar government and Al Jazeera. Egypt has accused Al Jazeera of inciting terrorism, and the network has been blocked from broadcast in all these countries for the past 2 weeks. Both the UAE's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, sorry, I don't know how to say that, and the Egyptian government blame Qatar for its support for the Muslim Brotherhood inside their countries. And I'll be talking about that later, but I have confirmed that they do indeed support the Muslim Brotherhood. Most importantly, the Saudis and Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in particular take a much harder line approach than Saudi governments of the past to Qatar's more nuanced relations with Iran. The Saudis' great rival, the message to Qatar's leadership is simple: fall in line or we will bury you. They hope either to force Qatari Emir Tamim bin Hamad to abandon the independence of his foreign policy, or to create conditions for a coup inside the emirate to remove him from power. Call this the Middle East Trump effect. The U.S. president's visit to Saudi Arabia last month made clear that the Trump sees Iran as the region's biggest problem, and that, in stark contrast to Barack Obama, Trump backs the Saudis 100%. That emboldens Saudi leaders to push hard to reassert Saudi leadership in the region, and to bring adventurous misfits like Qatar to heel. Well, here's how I feel about this. If Trump's going to depend on the Saudis so much, he better start pressuring the Saudis themselves to stop supporting terrorism. I mean, and I also don't agree that this is in stark contrast to Obama. Obama did plenty of backing of the Saudis. Maybe not to this extent, but he did back the Saudis. Will the Saudi strategy work? Qatar has little choice but to take its isolation seriously. Despite being home to the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, The country can't expect much support, even if the Emir calls Donald Trump for help. As the U.S. president made clear in his tweets on Wednesday morning, the tweets that, I'll read them again. So good to see the Saudi Arabia visit with the king in 50 countries already paying off. They said they would take a hard line on funding extremism, and all reference was pointing to Qatar. Perhaps this will be the beginning of the end of the horror of terrorism. So then we move on to Arab powers sever Qatar ties, citing support for militants. This is in Reuters. And the Arabs world, this other one was Time, by the way. So the Arab world's biggest powers cut ties with Qatar, accusing the support for Islamist militants and Iran, which this is, in these articles I'm reading from many different sources, this is really what the issue is Iran. And Qatar just keeps wanting to build closer and closer ties with Iran, which is definitely bad for the U.S. and all of these other Arab nations like Saudi Arabia. Because Iran and all these other Arab nations, they are different types of Muslims. And reopening a festering wound 2 weeks after U.S. President Donald Trump's demand for Muslim states to fight terrorism. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain severed diplomatic relations with Qatar in a coordinated move. It does show that the alliance they have is still strong as well, because keep in mind that this is effectively what happened to Israel when all these nations they allied together and attacked Israel all at once, or they built up forces on the Israeli border, and Israel basically did a preemptive strike. It was quite amazing. They destroyed the Air Force of Egypt in just a few hours. Then they went to Syria and destroyed their Air Force. And they effectively destroyed like 4 countries, the militaries of 4 countries, in just a couple of days. Then Jordan attacked, and they ended up destroying Jordan's good forces that were small in number, and it was quite amazing. That's actually what led to Israel used to be much smaller than it was now, and they gained a lot of land from that engagement. But it all started and Saudi Arabia is leading in this. Egypt was leading, and they basically wanted to create a single Arab nation. But Israel stood in the way. Qatar, a small peninsula nation of 2.5 million people that has a large U.S. military base, denounced the action as predicted on lies about its supporting militants. It has often been accused of being a funding source for Islamists, as has Saudi Arabia. But, what has me worried, they're claiming not to be supporting militants and things like that, when they clearly are, and we'll get to more articles that show that they are. And, denial is a common theme. Iran, long at odds with Saudi Arabia and behind-the-scenes target of the move, blamed Trump's visit last month to Riyadh and called for the sides to overcome their differences. What is happening is a preliminary result of the sword dance, tweeted Hamad Abu Talibi, deputy chief of staff to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, referring to Trump's joining in a traditional dance with the Saudi king at the meeting. Closing all transport links with Qatar, the 3 Gulf states gave Qatari visitors and residents 2 weeks to leave, and Saudi Arabia Bahrain, and Egypt banned Qatari planes from landing and forbade them from crossing their airspace. Qatar's stock market index sank 7.3%. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, that's the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia stopped exports of white sugar to Qatar, a potentially hit to consumers during the holy month of Ramadan when demand is high. Some residents in Qatar began stockpiling food and supplies, and expatriate said. People have stormed in the supermarket hoarding food. Supply difficulties quickly developed. Two Middle East trade sources spoke of thousands of trucks carrying food stuck at the Saudi border, unable to make the sole overland frontier crossing into Qatar. So that just, this shows that there are actually shortages starting already in terms of food. About 80% of Qatar's food requirements are sourced via bigger Gulf Arab neighbors. Trade, and that's serious. Like, think about that. 80% of their food is from these Arab countries that right now hate them. Trade sources pointed to the likelihood of shortages growing in Qatar until the crisis eased. Along with Egypt, however, the UAE and Saudi Arabia could be vulnerable to retaliation, being highly dependent on Qatar for liquefied natural gas. Except here's the problem for Qatar. So you could cut, your exports of natural gas to these countries, but you need that money. And so, I guess if you have a different seller, then or a different buyer, then you can sell it somewhere else. But the easiest and cheapest place to sell it would be to close to your neighbors. So that it would also hurt Qatar further to retaliate. The hawkish tone on Tehran and on terrorism that Trump brought in his visit to Muslim leaders and Riyadh is seen as having laid the groundwork for the diplomatic crisis. You have a shift in the balance of power in the Gulf because of the new presidency. Trump is strongly opposed to political Islam and Iran, said Jean-Marc Rickley, head of the global. Here's the thing. The U.S. has been strongly opposed to political Islam and Iran. And maybe Obama has turned a blind eye to some of the political Islam when there have been, competing interests. But Iran has always been a very serious threat, and we have not gotten along with Iran for a long time, decades. We have not even not hated Iran for decades. He is totally aligned with Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, who's also want no compromise with either Iran or the political Islam promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood. The United States called for a quick resolution of the dispute and does not want to see a permanent rift, a senior U.S. administration official said. And I think this is important. I think the U.S. supports what Saudi Arabia is doing, as the president tweeted out. But really what we're talking about is the U.S. wants something temporary that is going to show the leader of Qatar that, don't mess with the U.S., don't mess with your neighbors like this, because you need them. You need us. And by supporting Iran and building relations with Iran, you're really pissing us off. There's an acknowledgement that a lot of Qatari behavior is quite worrisome, not just to our Gulf neighbors, but to the U.S., the official said. We want to bring them in the right direction. A State Department official said all the U.S. partnerships with Gulf nations were vital and called on all parties to quickly resolve their differences. The U.S. military... I read this as the State Department tells Qatar to stop fucking with other Arab nations, stop supporting Iran, and stop pissing us off. The U.S. military said it had seen no impact to its Gulf area operations, intended mainly as a bulwark against Iran, and added it was grateful for Qatar's long-standing support of a U.S. presence and commitment to regional security. The diplomatic bust-up threatens the international prestige of Qatar, which is set to host the 2022 Soccer World Cup. Soccer's governing body, FIFA, said on Monday it was in regular contact with Qatar's 2022 organizing committee, but did not commit directly on the diplomatic situation. Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar's backing of Islamist states to a decision by the current emir's father to end a tradition of automatic deference to Saudi Arabia, the dominant Gulf Arab power, and forged the widest possible array of allies. That sounds all good and great, but when you're trying to ally with the U.S. and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel, good luck keeping them all happy. Doha subsequently cultivated not only Islamists like America's foes. Doha is the United Arab Emirates. America's foes, Iran, Hamas, and the Taliban in pursuit of leverage, but also Washington itself, hosting the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East. And, Qatar is relatively small. They're way overextending. They should be happy to rely on, one side, because they are so small that to try to leverage two sides, they don't have the power. Qatar has for years presented itself as a mediator and power broker for the region's many disputes, but Egypt and the Gulf Arab state, well, you can do that by being neutral and not growing ties with both sides. Qatar, think about how the U.S. Often mediates in the Israel-Palestine situation, but we definitely support Israel. Qatar has for years presented itself, the Muslim Brotherhood groups allied to Doha are now mostly on retreat in the region, especially after a 2013 military takeover in Egypt busted the elected Islamist president. Islamist president. The former army chief and now president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, along with Cairo's allies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, blacklist the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, which they are. The Brotherhood says it supports only peaceful politics. Oh, right. And the Brotherhood has a lot of connections inside the United States, by the way. They're a big problem. Saudi Arabia accused Qatar on Monday of backing militant groups and broadcasting their ideology, an apparent reference to Qatar's influential state satellite channel Al Jazeera. Later in the day, the king and, Al Jazeera, they do cause a lot of troubles. And they say a lot of ridiculous things. They'll claim to try to give everybody a voice, but they basically work as propaganda to say completely untrue things. Later in the day, the kingdom shut the Saudi bureau of Al Jazeera down. Al Jazeera says it is an independent news service giving a voice to everyone in the region. They are not independent at all. Their funding comes from the Qatari government. Rita also accused Qatar of supporting what is described as Iranian-backed militants in the rest of largely Shia Muslim-populated eastern Saudi region in Qatif, as well as Bahrain. Qatar denied it was interfering in the affairs of others. Of course they do, but they're denying it because they're denying all of this, but they do interfere. And when all they're doing is saying, basically plugging their ears and saying, no, we didn't do anything. They're doing some of this shit. There's no way they're doing none of this. And I'll get to an article in a bit where there is documentation that they have interfered. The campaign of incitement is based on lies and level of complete fabrications. Turkey also called for dialogue to settle the dispute, and a government spokesman said President Tayyip Erdogan was working for a diplomatic solution to the rift. Just what we need, Turkey getting involved. Sudan expressed its concern over the row and offered to mediate between all sides. To split between Doha and its closest allies could have repercussions around the Middle East, where Gulf states have used their financial and political power to influence events in Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The economic fallout was already hitting home. Dubai's Emirates airline and budget carriers Fly Dubai and Air Arabia said they would suspend all flights to and from Doha indefinitely from Tuesday morning. Qatar Airways said on its official website and suspended all flights to Saudi Arabia. Many Gulf airports, including in Qatar, are major hubs for international connecting flights. The measures are more severe than during a previous 8-month rift in 2014 when Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE withdrew their ambassadors from Doha, again alleging Qatari support for militant groups. At the time, the travel links were maintained and Qataris were not expelled. So this shows a definite escalation that is worrisome. Neighboring Kuwait has been mediating in the dispute, and its emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabbar Al-Sabah, that is a name, holy shit, urged Qatar's ruler to calm tensions and refrain from escalating the rift, Kuwait state news agency Kuna said. And is going to be up to Trump if Saudi Arabia gets away and actually starts attacking Qatar or anything like that, or refuses to eventually ease up these economic sanctions. That will be a mistake by Trump. This is supposed to be a small message to Qatar that something they can't ignore to curb their actions. And, it's not meant to be a situation that allows Saudi Arabia or these other countries to invade Qatar. I think if they tried to go that far, the U.S. would actually defend Qatar. Al-Sabah called on Qatar's Tamim bin Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani to give efforts at mediation a chance to contain differences. A few hours after Khalid Al Faisal, an advisor to the Saudi king, visited Kuwait. So there you have that. Sorry it's so much reading, but I want to give you a wide variety of, we have Time and Reuters. They're more on the left. And then I want to give you some older articles, and then I'll be giving you an article from the right as well. Because this is a really serious situation, and we need a good, rounded viewpoint. This one I'm just going to skim. It's from 2014. Remember how Qatar kept denying that they were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood? It says, behind Qatar's bet on the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood through a punishing crackdown in Egypt is in part a bet on the longevity of people-powered political movements. And this specifically breaks an agreement they have not to interfere in other countries' politics and things like that. And here they're supporting political or people-powered political movements. And it says, the only part of this I'm going to read is, while Qatar gave refuge to many Brotherhood members who were pushed out of Egypt and other countries, most notably the controversial and highly influential Egyptian Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Those figures have steered clearing of criticizing Qatar's leadership. In Qatar, religion doesn't play any role in articulating or forming oppositional sentiments, unlike in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, or the UAE. Look at the same countries. The same 4 countries. Says Maran Kamarava, director of the Center of International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University's Qatar campus. Remember, this is from 2014. And the reason is that the state has patronized the Muslim Brotherhood, as presented itself domestically and regionally and internationally as the patron of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if the price of domestic tranquility in a very turbulent region is Saudi ire, it's a small price to pay. So they knew this could happen, and they didn't care. What just happened with Qatar? From the Atlantic, Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, severed relations with Doha over its alleged support of terrorism. And the main part here is, but the catalyst for Monday's decision appears to be a Qatari news report last month that quoted Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani as criticizing Saudi Arabia, praising Iran, Saudi Arabia's main regional rival, and describing Qatar's relations with Israel as good. And it goes on. So you could see that a lot of what Qatar is denying is simply not true. They are doing things that they know will piss off these other countries. Qatari officials said the remarks were fake, and the news websites were a victim of a shameful cybercrime. Oh, right. So Al Jazeera says something that, other governments aren't a fan of, and suddenly what they're saying is fake. They've been hacked. It's a cybercrime, even though they have a long history of saying this shit. They did the same thing in the United States. But as David Roberts, a professor of defense studies at King's College, wrote for the BBC, the key problem was that these comments simply voiced out loud what many have long understood as Qatar's true policy position. Exactly. He adds, particularly under the leadership of the former Emir Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, Qatar sought to carve out a unique niche for itself and its policies, such as augmenting relations with Israel or Iran, and rejecting the wider consensus of the regional group of the monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council. I mean, this is an aggressive move on Qatar's behalf, so I don't understand why they would be surprised about some sort of response. And a response, quite frankly, is justified. So then we get to the Daily Caller. This is, run by Ben Shapiro. Many of you probably know him. On Monday, 6 major, and this is the last article I'm covering. On Monday, 6 major Islamo-Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, severed relations with Qatar, compounding existing concerns about regional instability. Keep in mind, that's not even all of them. There's more like Maldives and other countries. Led in large part by the Saudis, the move undoubtedly isolates the oil-rich Gulf country, leaving the Qatari Emir with only a handful of possible responses. Here are 5 things you need to know about the Qatar blow-up in the Middle East. Qatar's support for terrorism was cited as the chief reason for breaking diplomatic and consular ties. We've covered most of this. It's about the Muslim Brotherhood, but they've also supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they've supported Iran. They've supported basically everybody we don't, even in the U.S., everybody we pretty much don't want them to support. It's unclear if the Qataris are directly or even indirectly supporting ISIS, but The state's support for a variety of jihadist groups in the region is well documented. Qatar bankrolled with millions Arar al-Sham in Syria and tried to get al-Qaeda's al-Nusra off U.S. terror list via cosmetic break with al-Qaeda branch. Qatar also hosts senior members of al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas. Hamas as well. That's just great. Taliban even has an unofficial embassy. Doha is jihad central. Jesus. So I forgot about that. The Taliban even has an unofficial embassy in Qatar. So here's my issue. We put these bases all over the world, and we're in all these countries that maybe they're not perfect, but our whole point is to have influence around the world, so that we can drive culture and politics and, relationships. Well, what good is it to be in Qatar and then allow them to have relations with every fucking group we're fighting ourselves, such as the Taliban, such as Iran? I mean, what's the point in being there and being allied with them if we can't even drive them to not ally with these groups? And Hamas, I mean, these are groups that are largely the world community doesn't even support. The UN community, maybe I should say. And certainly not the NATO community. Overall, this is about Iran. Iran's military activities, covert operations, and ideological efforts over the last few years have been part of a parcel of geopolitical strategy to exercise control over the Shia crescent, stretching from Syria and Lebanon through Iran all the way to Bahrain. Reda and his Sunni allies believe that Qatar has been helping Iran achieve its imperialistic ambitions by financing and backing increasingly emboldened Shia rebels looking to topple governments in Bahrain, Yemen, and even Saudi Arabia. Suspicious about the Qatari's loyalties have been brewing for some time. While the timing of the diplomatic war seems spontaneous, it has only a matter of time before tensions boiled over between the Sunni coalition and Qatar. And that's something to remember. Most Muslims are Sunni, and Iran is actually Shia. So Iran is like one of the few countries that is Shia majority, and Shia and Sunnis hate each other. So here's the Shia crescent that they're talking about. And then he says, Qatar is supporting Muslim Brotherhood, a challenge for Saudi, UAE, and Egypt. Supporting Iran, a much bigger deal. So, yeah, you can live with supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, is what this guy is saying. But then when you start supporting Iran, that's a whole different level. Not surprisingly, Iran has condemned the decision to isolate Qatar. Well, when they're saying you're supporting Iran, and you're like, no, we're not. And then Iran's like, we condemn the actions against Qatar. It doesn't look too good. Neighbors are permanent. Geography can't be changed, stated Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. Coercion is never the solution. Dialogue is imperative, especially during blessed Ramadan. And clearly that's just bullshit. For Egypt, as they're constantly fighting each other. So for Egypt, this is about the Muslim Brotherhood. In Egypt, the Islamist group Muslim Brotherhood is public enemy number one. Under longtime Egyptian ruler President Hosni Mubarak, the Brotherhood was sent underground and castigated as a threat to civil society. But after Mubarak was thrown out of power during the Arab Spring Tahrir Square protests, the Brotherhood hijacked the democracy-minded protests against the regime, eventually advancing Islamist politician Mohamed Morsi as a candidate for president in post-Mubarak Egypt. Morsi ultimately received a majority of the vote in what was billed as a democratic election. Ultimately, he was exposed as a fanatic wolf in sheep's clothing. Following an attempt to rewrite the constitution, consolidate power, and eliminate judicial review, much like what Erdogan is doing in Turkey, the Egyptian military, led by General Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, initiated a coup and jailed Morsi. Sisi rose to power and went to work on purging the reawakened Brotherhood with merciless force. As long as Qatar lends its support to the Brotherhood, Egypt, particularly under Sisi, will take necessary steps to alienate and weaken Doha. And this is the problem. You know, when I said that Qatar is overextending itself, you can see the problem. It's Saudi Arabia that cares about some rebels, and Iran. But a lot of it has to do with the rebels. It's the U.S. that cares largely about Iran. It's Egypt that cares largely about the Muslim Brotherhood. And they've managed to piss all of these people off. Because they're just trying to be everybody's friend. And, they have completely competing interests. And they're all attacking each other. And, this is what bothers me. What the U.S. does too is we support all these groups that are competing to not only each other's interests but our own. And but at least we're big enough to we can handle ourselves. Qatar depends on other countries for 80% of their food. These Arab countries, and they depend on the U.S. for protection. I mean, they are way, way overextended. This is a political nightmare, strategic nightmare. This isn't your everyday diplomatic road. This is full-fledged crisis, and I agree. This is one of the things that I'm trying to get across to you guys, is this is not normal. This is the verge of war. These are potentially, could be considered acts of war already. 5 of the Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, although I'll say I don't think it will go to war, but that's how serious this is. 5 of the Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Libya, have suspended air and sea travel to and from Qatar. That's unprecedented, while a handful of these countries have periodically cut off and reinstated diplomatic ties with Qatar over the years. Neighboring countries in the Gulf have never blocked all transport to and from Qatar. Saudi Arabia has asked Qataris to leave the country. The kingdom will also block Qataris from entering the country. Bahrain and the UAE are asking their citizens to leave Qatar immediately. Qatar, in turn, is asking its citizens to leave Bahrain and the UAE. Qatari state-run propaganda Al Jazeera news offices in Saudi Arabia have been shut down by Saudi Arabia authorities as the Qataris criticize Saudi-run Al Arabia News. State-run airline companies have also curtailed their services. And furthermore, back to what happened to Israel a couple of decades ago, or a few decades ago. It was the 60s, I believe. Effectively, they cut off access to Israel through the sea as well. This is something that when things are getting very serious, that's what they do. Airlines halting to Qatar. And then there's a bunch of listed airlines. It says Qatar has responded saying that the decision to cut ties is a violation of sovereignty. Not really. I mean, countries can choose not to have ties with other countries. That's part of their sovereignty. The state of Qatar has been subjected to a campaign of lies and have reached the point of complete fabrication. It reveals a hidden plan to undermine the state of Qatar, reads a statement released by the Qatari foreign minister. Qatar is an active member of the Gulf Cooperation Council and is fully committed to its charter. Qatar respects the sovereignty of the other nations and does not interfere in their internal affairs, and it has fulfilled its role in fighting terrorism and extremism, continues the statement. It is clear that the media campaign of fabrications has failed to sway public opinion in the region and among Gulf countries in particular, and this explains the continued escalation against Qatar. Except what they're saying about you is 100% true, as article after article is explaining, on the left and the right. Their purpose is clearly the imposition of, and I even went back to 2014, Qatar, where you admitted you were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and groups like that, and political people, what was it, like people-led political movements or something like that? People-supported political movements. Their purpose is clearly the imposition of guardianship over Qatar, which is in itself a violation of its sovereignty and is rejected outright, concludes the statement. In other words, Qatar is denying that it has been supporting destabilizing terrorist activity in the region, despite evidence to the contrary. Exactly. Interestingly enough, the foreign, and who are they really, like, this is what I don't get. Who are you speaking to? Like, the U.S. is against you. All these Arab countries are against you. Are you speaking to Iran? Are you trying to speak to European countries? I mean, who are you trying to speak to come to your side? You're pissing everybody off. Interestingly enough, the Foreign Ministry's official statement fails to include Egypt in the list of countries participating in the cessation of ties. Egypt appears to be more ambivalent about the decision than Saudi Arabia, the powerhouse Gulf state that's leading the cavalry charge. In fact, Egypt has not pushed forward rhetoric about expelling citizens in the wake of the geopolitical crisis. Qatar doesn't appear to be retaliating against Egyptian citizens either. Nevertheless, Egypt has demanded that Qatar's ambassador leave within 48 hours, demonstrating clearly which side of the dispute they stand on. My guess is that they see Egypt as reachable and maybe want to get to Saudi Arabia by trying to keep some sort of ties with Egypt. And these alliances get complicated. I mean, if Saudi Arabia is leading the charge, they might understand that Egypt basically has to follow. So that's that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. And this is a very serious situation. It could spin out of control in more ways than one. I mean, you could have a war. I don't think you would, but then there's a whole chance of a humanitarian crisis. And I think this all goes back to actually the U.S. trying to isolate Iran and the U.S. trying to isolate Russia. We haven't really done as much with China, but the U.S. seems to really be trying to isolate Russia and Iran and trying to separate the two. And we're trying to build all sorts of defenses between Russia and Iran, so Russia can't easily help Iran. And, you know, that's one of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran is one of the most, and it is the most annoying alliance for the U.S. We can deal with China because they're not very aggressive, although they're very economic. But Russia is very aggressive, and Iran is very aggressive. And they, you know, when we're meddling in Syria, Russia is a problem. and Iran's a problem. When we're in Iraq, Iran's a problem. So, and in Afghanistan, and all over the region, Iran seems to be coming, especially under the Trump administration. I think Iran's becoming a bigger focus than Russia, and I expect that to continue. I think you'll see main focuses on North Korea and Iran, more Iran than North Korea. Although, for now, I think, given some time, North Korea is going to be a big problem we just can't ignore. But you can expect more action against Iran. So anyways, have a good one, guys.